The Bible, How to Study It, Lesson 5, The Apocrypha, by Alice Young. Introduction. The Old Testament Apocrypha. The meaning of the word is obscure, hidden. That is books in the that really don't belong in the Bible. Comprise 14 books. They're found in some Bibles between the Old and New Testaments. Many of them are in the Catholic Bible. I call them Old Testament not because they belong in the Old Testament. In other words, they're not canonical books. They're as the basic 39 Old Testament books are, but I call them that because they're written in Old Testament times. Here's an example. They originated in the third to the first centuries BC and are mostly of uncertain authorship. As I said, none of these books are Hebrew in the Hebrew Bible, in our Old Testament. They were written after Old Testament prophecy ceased, and Old Testament prophecy. Of course, Jesus prophesied in the New Testament, but there was about 400 years there between the Testaments when there was no prophecy going on. The Septuagint, which is the translation from the Hebrew into the Greek, made about 200 BC, added the Apocrypha. At some point, however, these books were added to the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that was made during that period. The Apocrypha, notice that's plural, were never recognized by the Jews as part of the Hebrew Scriptures. Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian, rejected them as a whole. Here we see Jesus teaching the people. Notice the acoustic effect that must have occurred there. The people were there in a little valley, and when he spoke to them, they could hear all the way across. They were never quoted by Jesus nor anyone else anywhere in the New Testament. How did they get into the Septuagint in the first place? We'll consider this question next. How did the Apocrypha get into some Bibles? So if they were not recognized by the early church as either canonical or divinely inspired, then how did they end up in many Bibles? Probably simply because they were in the Septuagint, which was the basis of many of the other ancient translations, including the Old Latin. The Septuagint seems to have represented a compendium of Jewish literature for Greek speakers who did not have the same faith and cultural background as the Jews. Perhaps that's why those books were in it. In other words, it was a collection of Jewish literature that the Greeks might have been interested in. Evidently, they were all these books were written by Jews. That might also explain why they ended up in Catholic Bibles, because it was included in the Old Latin. The Latin was translated. Was translated from the Septuagint, which was the Greek version, not directly from the Hebrew. The Old Testament portion of the Latin Vulgate, translated by Jerome, followed the Septuagint order instead of the Hebrew. Since the apocryphal books were in the Greek Bible Jerome used, he simply translated them and made them part of the Bible that became the basis of all later Catholic Bibles until the 20th century. And since Roman Catholics are traditionalists, more so than Protestants, they have kept the Apocrypha in their Bibles. There are Catholic doctrines that have been found only in the Apocrypha, like the doctrine of purgatory. Here we see Alexandria in Egypt. This is where the Septuagint was translated from Hebrew to Greek by 70 scholars. That's where they get the name Septuagint. That means 70. And there were supposedly 70 translators. Hebrew translator, Hebrew speaking and Greek speaking. The Jewish literature of the day. Besides the biblical canon, these books were probably the only Jewish literature of their day. The Jewish scholars who gave the world a Septuagint might have wanted to give the Greek readers all the Jewish literature they had at the time. But the Jews always made a distinction between the canonical and non-canonical books in their Hebrew Bible. Might have been a collection of literature, but it wasn't the Bible. This is a section from the Old Latin version, and this comes down to us from the 2nd century AD. Other early translations. After the Bible was translated into Greek, which seems to have been the first translation of the Bible in any language, the Septuagint, the Bible was translated in other languages, many languages. It was translated into Latin in the 2nd century AD. Here's a copy of the Old Latin translation. Its Old Testament was translated from the Greek Old Testament, there's the Septuagint, and the order of the books were as they were in the Greek. In fact, we get many of our names for the books, like Genesis, a Greek word that means the beginning. The Septuagint version of the Old Testament and the books that were included in it were kept. Thus, as already mentioned, the apocryphal books were included in the early Latin translation of the Bible, which, as we said, was made from the Septuagint. Here, I guess it's a Jerome. The Old Latin version was revised. In a cave near Bethlehem in the years 382 to 390, Jerome translated the Bible into Latin. His translation is called the Vulgate, meaning the one in common use. From the Old Latin version came the Latin Vulgate, Jerome's translation, a revision of the Old Latin, which became the common version in Western Europe until the time of the Reformation. The fancy Bible. Protestant and Catholic Bibles, they are different. Apocryphal books are not recognized as canonical by Protestants, but are included in some Protestant Bibles between the Old and New Testament as books that are good to read. Deuterocanonical books. In Roman Catholic Bibles, the Apocrypha, with the exception of 1st and 2nd Esdras, or the prayer of the Manasseh, are interspersed with the canonical Old Testament books and are called deuterocanonical books, belonging to a secondary canon. Name differences. To complicate matters, the Roman Catholic Church uses the term Apocrypha for another group of books, such as the Testament of Adam and 3rd and 4th Maccabees, that are not usually included in Roman Catholic or Protestant Bibles. The Protestant term for this group was pseudepigrapha, writings falsely ascribed. Writings falsely ascribed. That's the pseudepigrapha. False writing. Pseudo means false. Protestant Bibles have none of the books included in their canon. In some versions, they are placed between the Testaments. I believe we've already mentioned that. The translators of some versions put them in a separate volume. The King James translators did that. They translated Apocrypha, but they put them in a different volume, different book. What Protestants call the Apocrypha, the Catholics call deuterocanonical books. The Catholic Bible put between the Old and New Testaments these books: Tobit, Judith, Wisdom of Solomon, Ecclesiasticus, 1 Maccabees, 2 Maccabees, and Baruch. The other deuterocanonical books they interspersed with the canonical books: additions to Esther, letter of Jeremiah, additions to Daniel, 1st Esdras, 2nd Esdras, and the prayer of Manasseh. In other words, Esdras is really Esther. Is Ezra. The Hebrew is Ezra, and the prayer of Manasseh. Esdras teaches the law. That's in the book of Ezra too. You tell about him on a pulpit raised up above the people teaching the law, and the scholars or the rabbis walked among the people, helping interpret and translating, explaining what Esdras was reading. A brief overview of the Apocrypha. Historical books. First Esdras is the Greek form of Ezra. This book is a compilation of passages from Ezra 2, Second Chronicles, and Nehemiah, with added legends about Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel was a leader from the tribe of Judah that was placed over the people when they returned from Babylon, from the Babylonian captivity. This is the tomb of Cyrus, the one who signed or proclaimed the return of the Jews to Jerusalem, or to Judea. It's in Iran. Cyrus was a Persian, and Iran, of course, was called Persia at one time. Its object was to picture the generosity of Cyrus and Darius toward the Jews, and a pattern for the Ptolemies of Egypt to emulate. At the time it was written, Palestine was under the domination of Egypt and the Ptolemies. Ptolemy was a general that after Alexander the Great died, he received Egypt as his to reign over. Alexander's empire was split up into 4 parts, and Egypt was one of the parts. Egypt and Palestine. A famous descendant of Ptolemy was Cleopatra. Folks, that's not a photograph. First Esdras, a sample, the first paragraph of First Esdras. Josiah kept the Passover to his Lord in Jerusalem. He killed the Passover lamb on the 14th day of the first month, having placed the priests according to their divisions, arrayed in their vestments, in the temple of the Lord. Here's the artist's rendition of the Ark of the Covenant with a cherubim on each end, facing with their wings o'erspread. I don't think they look like that at all. He told the Levites, the temple servants of Israel, that they should sanctify themselves to the Lord and put the holy ark of the Lord in the house that King Solomon, son of David, had built. And he said, "You need no longer carry it yourself. You're on your shoulders." History books continued. First Maccabees, a historical work of great value on the Maccabean period, relating the events of the Jews' heroic struggle for their liberty, 175 to 135 BC. It was written about 100 BC by a Palestinian Jew who had been there and done that. He'd actually seen it. It's a good history. It's an accurate history, but it's not inspired. It is no doubt the most valuable of all the Apocrypha as an accurate history of the time of the Maccabees. But it contains an admission that it was not written by a prophet. First Maccabees in the Gutenberg Bible, the first Bible to be printed with movable type. First Bible to be printed, period. The very best of the Apocrypha was not inspired. In other words, none of it was inspired. Even the best book of the Apocrypha was not inspired, and the author admitted that he was not inspired. How do we know that First Maccabees was not inspired? And they laid up the stone in the mountain of the temple in a convenient place till there should come a prophet and give answer concerning them. First Maccabees 4:46. Here we have the Maccabean revolt, and it's hard to see all that small print, and you need to read the First Maccabees to get the story. First Maccabees 9:27. Speaking about the persecutions under Bacchides, who killed all the Jewish leaders, there has not been such great distress in Israel since the time prophets ceased to appear among the people. And First Maccabees 14:41. The Jewish people and their priests have therefore made the following decision: Simon shall be their permanent leader and high priest until a true prophet arises. Death of Alexander the Great. See, he's laying on his sick bed there. Some people think he was poisoned by one of his generals. First Maccabees, a sample of the writing. This gives you a flavor of the historical accuracy and value of it as a history. To give a flavor of the style of the book, I have copied its first paragraph. After Alexander, son of Philip the Macedonian, who came from the land of Kittim, had defeated King Darius of the Persians and the Medes. He succeeded him as king. He had previously become king of Greece. He fought many battles, conquered strongholds, and put to death the kings of the earth. He advanced to the ends of the earth and plundered many nations. That's Alexander the Great. Historical books continued. Second Maccabees. This is also an account of the Maccabean struggle, containing itself, confining itself to the period of 175 to 161 BC. It professes to be an abridgment of a work written by a certain Jason of Cyrene, of whom nothing is known. It supplements First Maccabees, but is inferior to it. Second Maccabees, the sample paragraph. No claims or evidence of inspiration. The Jewish brethren in Jerusalem and those in the land of Judea, to their Jewish brethren, this is evidently a letter, to the Jewish brethren in Egypt, greetings and good peace. May God do good to you, and may he remember his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob as faithful servants. May he give you all a heart to worship him and to do his will with a strong heart and a willing spirit. May he open your heart to his law and his commandments, and may he bring peace. May he hear your prayers and be reconciled to you, and may he not forsake you in the times of evil. You see that it's inferior in the wording there. We're reconciled to God, he's not reconciled to us. Second Maccabees continued. Second Maccabees teaches praying for the dead. It is therefore a holy and wholesome thought to pray for the dead, that they may be loosened from sins. Of course, people, they're baptized, they're loosened from sins. Jesus said, if you die in your sins, where I go, you can't come. Unless you believe I am he, you'll die in your sins. Where I go, you can't come. So when you die, your fate is set. It doesn't matter how much people pray for you. From this, we can see why some of these books might be promoted by the Catholic Church. They believe in praying for the dead. Mormons are baptized for the dead, but that's not in the Bible. Well, it talks about being baptized for the dead, but it's not in the Old Testament, of course. Religious fiction. Tobit is healed of his blindness. Tobias, a romance entirely devoid of historical value of a rich young Israelite captive in Nineveh, that's in Assyria, now it's in present, it's called Mosul in Iraq, who was led by an angel to wed a virgin widow. What's a virgin widow? Who had lost 7 husbands. A virgin widow who had lost 7 husbands. You can see why some of these apocryphal books have little or no value. Judas, that's another one. Judas returns to Bethulia with the head of Holofernes. Judas, a historical romance of a rich, beautiful, and devout Jewish widow who, in the days of the Babylonian captivity invasion of Judah, adroitly went to the tent of the Babylonian general and, under guise of offering herself to him, cut off his head and thus saved her city. Additions to the Book of Esther. Interpolated, that is inserted in several places, passages in the Septuagint version of the Old Testament Book of Esther, mainly to show the hand of God in the story. Remember, the Book of Esther doesn't mention God at all in the canonical book. These fragments were gathered and grouped together by Jerome. Additions to the Book of Daniel. The prayer of Azariah and the sons, the song of the three Jews, and inauthentic addition to the Book of Daniel, inserted after 3:23, chapter 3, verse 23, purporting to give the prayer while in the fiery furnace, and their triumphal song of praise for deliverance. You can't, this is a video, so you can't use that link, but you can copy it and put it, type it in your browser and go there. And anytime you have a problem with hearing or reading or anything, you reverse and you can go backwards, or you pause and spend more time on a page. Susanna, another inauthentic amplification of the Book of Daniel, relating how the godly wife of a wealthy Jew in Babylon, falsely accused of adultery, was cleared by the wisdom of Daniel. More additions to the Book of Daniel. Bel and the Dragon, another inauthentic addition to the Book of Daniel. It consists of two stories, in both of which Daniel proves that the idols Bel and the dragon are not gods. One of these is based on the story of the lion's den. Wisdom literature. Wisdom of Solomon, or simply wisdom, very similar to parts of Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. It is a kind of fusion of Hebrew thought and Greek philosophy, and was written by an Alexandrian Jew who presents himself as Solomon, claims to be Solomon. Wisdom literature continued. Ecclesiasticus, also called the wisdom of Jesus the son of Sirach, or simply Sirach. Jesus is the Greek form of Joshua, or Yeshua. So it comes from the Greek translation. It resembles the book of Proverbs and was written by a widely traveled Jewish philosopher. It gives rules for conduct in all details of civil, religious, and domestic life, and extols a long list of Old Testament heroes. It is inferior to the wisdom literature of the canon. Well, of course, the Book of Esther is not quoted in the New Testament either. Ecclesiasticus. This book makes unacceptable statements about the value or worth of women and girls, and must have been written by a blatant misogynist. Ecclesiasticus 25:19. Any iniquity is insignificant compared to a wife's iniquity. Terrible stuff, huh? Ecclesiasticus 22:3. It is a disgrace to be the father of an undisciplined son, and the birth of a daughter is a loss. Wow. Wisdom literature continued. Baruch, a book that purportedly comes from Baruch, the scribe of Jeremiah. You know, they've actually found his seal, Baruch's seal. See Jeremiah 32:12 through 13 and 45:1. Baruch, who is represented as spending the last part of his life in Babylon. It is addressed to the exiles. It consists mostly of paraphrases from Jeremiah, Daniel, and other prophets. Looking at that right now, I can't figure out what that is unless it's some kind of writing, ancient Hebrew writing. Ancient bullae from the land of Israel. Oh, I know what those are. Those are seal impressions. Display of a bulla from Baruch's seal. In 1975, the first few pieces of 200 clay bullae were discovered in the shop of an antiques dealer in East Jerusalem. Bullae are lumps of clay which were attached to documents and impressed with a seal. I think in the Middle Ages they melted wax. They dripped wax where the envelope overlapped or where the envelope attached, the flap of an envelope attached to the envelope, and then drop a drip of wax on there, and then they'd press it with a seal. I don't have an example of that to show you. Baruch, writing Jeremiah's prophecies. He was Jeremiah's scribe, sometimes called an amanuensis. From the shape of the Hebrew characters, which vary throughout history, scholars date the collection to the 6th century BC, the time of Jeremiah. With this collection are 2 bullae believed to have belonged to Baruch and Jeremiel, I guess. Baruch seal. And here's a blow up and a good copy of his seal. There's the actual seal on the right hand side. This was actually made by Baruch, the scribe of Jeremiah. This is one of the great artifacts found by the archaeologists in Palestine. The 3 lines on the Baruch bullae read, belonging to Baruch, Beruchiahu, Baruch, the son of Neriyahu, the scribe. And that's the actual scribe of Jeremiah. Can't read it very well, but that's him. More on the Baruch bulla. The March-April 1996 issue of Biblical Archaeology Review features an article on another bulla belonging to a private collector from the same seal. What is unique about this is the clear impression of a finger on the upper left of the bulla. The article suggested this was the fingerprint of Jeremiah, scribe. Here we have Jeremiah dictating his letter to his scribe. Bible people were real people. They lived when the Bible said they did. While it presumes, what is presumptuous to assume that this is Brooks' fingerprint, at the very least, discoveries such as this remind us that people in the Bible were not imaginary figures from fairy tales, but real souls who served our God in the past. Wisdom literature continued. The letter of Jeremiah, an appendix to Baruch. Prayer of Manasseh, a book that purports to be the prayer of Manasseh, king of Judah, when he was held captive in Babylon. See 2 Chronicles 33:12-13. The author is unknown, but the book probably comes from the 1st century BC. Here we see a prophet, I guess, looking into the future. Apocalyptic literature. 2nd Ezra, sometimes called 4th Ezra, it purports to contain visions given to Ezra dealing with God's government of the world, a coming new age, and the restoration of certain lost scriptures. Roman bust representing Flavius Josephus, a historian who lived in the time of Jesus, 1st century. The consistent testimony of the ancients. Josephus, from Artaxerxes to our own time. This is Josephus writing. From Artaxerxes to our own time, the complete history has been written, but has not been deemed worthy of equal credit with the earlier records because of the failure of the exact succession of the prophets. That's what he says about the. We have not an innumerable multitude of books among us, disagreeing from and contradicting one another, but only 22 books. Of course, the Hebrews divided into the same number as their alphabet. We have 39 in the Old Testament. They had 22. They combined some of them, which contain the records of all the past times, which are justly believed to be divine. Flavius Josephus against Apion. Here we have I guess on the Mediterranean Sea we have an excavation of some, probably Jamnia. No, it's the Qumran. This is the Dead Sea. Excavations at Qumran on the Dead Sea. Testimony of the ancients continued. The Qumran community, where the Dead Sea Scrolls, who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, and who hid them, reject the Apocrypha as uninspired. The Council of Jamnia, 70 A.D., held the same view and rejected the Apocrypha as uninspired. The Council at Jamnia. They debated the canonicity of a few books, Ecclesiasticus, but they changed nothing and never proclaimed themselves to be authoritative determiners of the Old Testament canon. The books which they decided to acknowledge as canonical were already generally accepted, although questions had been raised about them. Those which they refused to admit had never been included. They did not expel from the canon any book which had previously been admitted. So the Council at Jamnia actually didn't change anything about the Old Testament canon, but they just affirmed it. Council at Jamnia continued. The Council of Jamnia was the confirming of public opinion, not the forming of it. F. Bruce. The Books and Parchments, that's the name of his book. Old Tappan, New Jersey. Fleming H. Revel, 1963. On page 98. This is a mosaic tile portrait of Didymus Judas Thomas. Okay, Thomas was one of the apostles. He's called Didymus because he was a twin. That means twin in Greek. The so-called Christian Apocrypha. These were written later than the Old Testament Apocrypha, of course. There are a plethora of books written after the death and resurrection of Jesus that claim to have been based in fact and even to have been written by inspired men. Of course, they were not. Some of these are called the Christian Apocrypha, not because they were Christian, but because they were written in the Christian era and claimed to have been Christian connection, to have a Christian connection. Without taking the time to describe any of these books, I will simply list them and the headings of the various genre to which they belong, the subject matter belong. It would take all day to talk about them, really. Okay, those that belong to the genre called the Gospels. I'd call them fake Gospels. The Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, on papyrus, fragment of an unknown Gospel, fragments of unknown Gospels, Jewish Christian Gospels, the Gospel of Hebrews, Nazarenes, Ebionites, Gospel of the Egyptians, Secret Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Nicodemus, Acts of Pilate, and Descent to Hades, Birth and Infancy Gospels, Protoevangelon of James, Infancy Gospel of Thomas, History of Joseph, Infancy Gospel of Matthew, Arabic Infancy Gospel, and Latin Infancy Gospel. Post-resurrection Gospels, Apocalypse of Peter, Epistle of the Apostles, Questions of Bartholomew, Testament of our Lord, Testament of our Lord in Galilee. I'm recording. Apocrypha, Apocryphon of James, Book of Thomas, Sophia, meaning wisdom in Greek, of Jesus Christ, the wisdom of Jesus Christ. Boy, there's a lot of them now. I've never even seen those. Post-resurrection Gospels continued. Like I said, there's a plethora of those. Can you say that? Plethora? I almost can't say it. Dialogue of the Savior, First Apocalypse of James, Coptic or Gnostic Apocalypse of Peter, Gospel of Mary. I'm not going to tell you how many of these there are. There's a plethora. How do you count a plethora? Myriad. Letter of Peter to Philip, second part. Pistis Sophia. Pistis in Greek means faith, wisdom, the wisdom of faith. Book of Jew. Books of Jew, Jeu. I don't know if that has any meaning. Apostolic Acts. Acts of Andrew. Acts of John. Acts of Paul. Acts of Peter. Acts of Thomas. Acts of Peter and the 12 Apostles. Apostolic Epistles. Epistle of the Apostles. You say that quickly 4 times. Epistle of the Apostles. Apocrypha of James. That reminds me of the Inspector General. Remember when Danny, whatever his name is, they says now there's poison and there's the potion of the, let's see, the vessel with the pestle has the potion that is poison, but the what is the other one from the palace? The chalice from the palace has the brew that is true. Then he got all mixed up. No, now because the potion that is poison is in the chalice of the palace, and the potion with the poison is in the other one. Anyway, it was a comedy routine, kind of like Who's on First with Abbott and Costello. 3 Corinthians, parts of Acts of Paul, Laodiceans, letter of Peter to Philip, correspondence of Paul and Seneca, epistle of Titus. I'm getting kind of tired of this, aren't you? Preaching of Peter, prayers of the Apostle Paul, prayer of the Apostle Paul, second Apocalypse of James, pseudo Clementine literature, Clement of Rome, accounts of the Dormition, Assumption of the Virgin, apocalyptic and prophetic literature, Apocalypse of Peter, Ascension of Isaiah, Apocalypse of Thomas, Apocalypse of Paul, Coptic or Gnostic Apocalypse of Paul, and the Coptic or Gnostic Apocalypse of Peter. Christian Sibylline Oracles, 5th Ezra, 6th Ezra, Coptic Apocalypse of Elijah, Apocalypse of the Virgin Mary, Greek Apocalypse of Ezra, Apocalypse of Sidrach. Apocalyptic and prophetic literature continue. Latin vision of Ezra, questions of Ezra, Apocalypse of Daniel, apocalypses of Daniel, 7th vision of Enoch. Wisdom literature. We're coming to the end of this. Teachings of Sylvanus. Hymnic literature. Odes of Solomon. Wow, that was a lot, huh? Actually, there are many more than these, too many to list it in one class session. And besides, I'm getting tired out talking about this stuff. Most of us, including me, have never heard of half of these. I certainly don't intend to waste my time reading all of them. Here's this shows the Eastern Empire of the Roman Empire. And there's the city of Nicaea up there in Asia Minor. Letters of the Ante-Nicene Fathers. Ante means before the Council of Nicaea. There were many letters to individuals and churches written by men who knew the apostles personally. Those who lived and wrote in the period between the beginning of the church and the Council of Nicaea in 325 are called the Ante-Nicene Fathers. A few letters from these men have come down to us. Some of them are listed here. Here is a partial list of these early writers: Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Rome, Mathetes, Polycarp, Ignatius, Barnabas, Papias, Hermas, Tatian, Theophilus, Athenagoras, Clement of Alexander, and there were a few others less important. None of these claim to be prophets, but their writings are important for understanding the early days of Christianity. Ante-Nicene Fathers continue. Some of these writers have a unique perspective concerning the interpretation of some Bible passages. Many of them allegorize the Old Testament laws. They give to many of these things that seem to be literal on the surface, a deeper spiritual meaning. This is especially true of the Epistle of Barnabas. I would like to give you one example from the Epistle of Barnabas. He is writing to give a spiritual explanation for the law of the clean and unclean animals in Leviticus 11. Now, wherefore did Moses say, Thou shalt not eat the swine, nor the eagle, nor the hawk, nor the raven, nor any fish which is not possessed of scales? He embraced these doctrines in his mind. In doing so, moreover, the Lord saith to them in Deuteronomy, And I will establish my ordinances among the peoples. Is there then not a command of God they should not eat these things? There is, but Moses spoke with a spiritual reference. For this reason he named the swine, as much as to say, Thou shalt not join thyself to men who resemble swine, for whom they live in pleasure. They forget their Lord, but when they come to want, they acknowledge the Lord, and in like manner the swine, when it has eaten, does not recognize its master, but when hungry it cries out, and on receiving food is quiet again. Neither shall you eat, says he, the eagle, the hawk, the kite, or the raven. Thou shalt not join thyself, he means, to such men as know not how to procure for themselves by labor and sweat, but seize on that of others for in their iniquity, and although wearing an aspect of simplicity, are on the watch to plunder others. So the birds, while they sit idle, inquire how they may devour the flesh of others, proving themselves pests to all by their wickedness. And thou shalt not eat, he says, the lamprey, or the polypus, or the cuttlefish. He means thou shalt not join thyself to be like to such men as are ungodly to the end, and are condemned to death, is like in like manner to these fishes above accursed float in the deep, not swimming on the surface like the rest, but make their abode in the mud which lies at the bottom. Oh man. Moreover, thou shalt not, he said, eat the hare, wherefore thou shalt not be a corrupter of boys, nor like unto such, because the hare multiplies year by year the place of its conception, for as many years as it lives, so many it has. Can I just pass through some of these, because I don't want to read all this stuff. I'll just let you read it. I'm tired. Well, who would want to eat a hyena? Forget that. Remember, this is certainly not inspired stuff. I don't know why we're reading this much of it. Who would want to eat a weasel? Well, I certainly wouldn't want to be like a weasel. Given some words in the English language, we don't know weasel out of things, do we? Like some of our Republican people are trying to weasel out of replacing Obamacare. Wow, all these quotations from the Epistle of Barnabas. Tomb of King David in Jerusalem. I'm glad we finally got away from the Epistle of Barnabas. I was getting tired of that. Oh, I guess we haven't. I'm sorry. We're going to do quote the whole thing, the whole book. I hope not. When I put all this stuff together, I was a lot younger and had a lot more energy. If you want to read this, you can pause it until you can read all of it, but I'm going to kind of skip through it. It is kind of interesting, but I don't want to read all of it. Finally, we come to the conclusion of this video. The non-canonical books are many and may provide interesting reading for some, but the consensus of the majority of Jewish and Christian Bible scholars down through these centuries is that these books are not inspired and should not be used as like the canonical scriptures for doctrinal purposes. The Apocrypha. I wrote this poem so long ago I don't remember what I was thinking when I wrote it. 32 teeth in the mouth will grow. There are 88 keys on a piano. You have 2 nostrils in your nose and a total of 24 fingers and toes. 20 fingers and toes, sorry. I knew a guy that had 24. He had 6 on each hand and foot. "12 apostles Jesus chose, later replacing one of those. 7 days are in a week. God has one Son who's unique. God has one Son who is unique. Numbers, count. There must be just the right amount. 66 books in the Bible belong. No more, no less. That would be wrong. The Apocrypha would make too many. Are they inspired? No, not any. The Apocrypha are fun to read, but they are books we do not heed. We do not need, heed or need. Lesson 6. Okay, next lesson is lesson 6. Evidences for the historical accuracy of the Bible. Evidences for the historical accuracy of the Bible. There we have the walking man. He's walking around the world taking the gospel while he has time as the world turns. The inspired gospel is the power of God for salvation to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Romans 1:16. What does Romans 16:16 say? The churches of Christ salute you. The end. Finally, I'm out of breath, I'm out of patience, and I'm so glad we finally finished this. This was a chore for me with COPD and bad eyesight. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being with me. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.